The basic meal, the hash, corn, peas. In this case, a little intelligent pre-preparation.
Hi, my name is Charles, and this is Great Britain Nostalgia. In 1953, your grandmother walked into a kitchen with no food processor, no non-stick pans, and no supermarket loyalty card telling her what to buy. She fed a family of 5 on a wage that would make your eyes water today. And she did it using 15 kitchen secrets so effective, so quietly brilliant, that entire industries were built to make sure you never learned them. Secret. 15. Bicarbonate of soda in the washing up bowl. Before washing up liquid became a kitchen staple, your grandmother cleaned her pots and pans with a pinch of bicarbonate of soda dissolved into warm water. Not the whole box, a pinch. Enough to make the water slightly alkaline, which cuts through grease far more effectively than plain hot water and does not leave a chemical residue on the surfaces your family eats from. Here is the part that genuinely unsettled me. When I first came across it, modern washing up liquids contain synthetic surfactants, preservatives, and fragrances, many of which leave microscopic residue on dishes even after rinsing. Bicarbonate of soda leaves nothing. It dissolves completely. Your Nan was not being cheap. She was being safer than the bottle under your sink. A box of bicarbonate of soda costs 65 pence and lasts months. The average British household spends over £40 a year on washing up liquid. More importantly, that washing up liquid is marketed as essential, as it was never essential. Your grandmother fed a family of 5 using something that costs less than a penny per wash and leaves no trace behind. The supermarkets need you to believe that clean requires chemicals. Your Nan proved otherwise every single day. Secret 14. Saving bacon fat in a jar. When your grandmother finished frying bacon, she did not tip the fat down the drain. She poured it carefully through a small sieve into a glass jar that sat beside the hob. That jar was one of the most valuable things in her kitchen, and she treated it accordingly. Bacon fat was her cooking oil, her flavoring agent, and her secret weapon. She fried eggs in it, she roasted potatoes in it, she spread it cold onto bread when butter was running low. She used it to fry onions at the base of a stew, giving the whole dish a depth of flavor that no vegetable oil on earth can replicate. In 1956, a pound of bacon cost about 2 shillings. Every rasher earned its keep twice. Once on the plate at breakfast, once in the jar beside the hob, waiting to make everything else better. The shift happened gradually through the 1970s and 1980s, when the food industry, alongside medical bodies, declared saturated fat the enemy. Lead disappeared from kitchen shelves. Dripping was quietly retired. Bacon, fat jars, were emptied and thrown away. We replaced them with vegetable oils, spreads, and low-fat alternatives that required factories to produce and supermarkets to sell. Recent nutritional research has been quietly walking back many of those 1980s claims about animal fats. Your Nan did not need a research paper. She just needed the bacon to taste right. It always did. Secret 13. Newspaper to ripen tomatoes. There is something about this one that I find myself randomly thinking about at 2 in the morning. It just refuses to leave me alone. Because it is so simple, so completely free, and so perfectly effective that the fact we stopped doing it is almost insulting. When your grandmother had green or underripe tomatoes, she did not leave them on the windowsill and hope for the best. She wrapped each one individually in a sheet of newspaper and placed them in a single layer in a cool, dark drawer. Within 3 to 5 days, they came out perfectly ripe, deep red, sweet, and ready. The science is straightforward. Tomatoes ripen in response to ethylene gas, which they produce themselves. Newspaper traps that gas close to the fruit, creating a microenvironment that accelerates ripening without the heat damage that a sunny windowsill causes. Supermarkets use a commercial version of this same principle to ripen fruit in controlled warehouses before it hits the shelves. The difference is that your Nan used yesterday's Daily Mirror. The supermarket uses a patented gas injection system and charges you accordingly. In the 1960s, tomatoes cost about 4 pence a pound at the greengrocer. The ones that came in unripe were kept rather than wasted. A family that wasted food in 1962 was a family that went without by Thursday. The newspaper trick cost nothing and saved everything. Secret 12. Mustard powder in cheese sauce. Your grandmother did not measure her mustard powder. She tipped a little into the palm of her hand, looked at it, decided it was probably right, and added it to the sauce. She had been doing it long enough that her palm was the only measuring device she needed. A 1/4 teaspoon of dry mustard powder added to a cheese sauce before the cheese goes in does something remarkable. It does not make the sauce taste of mustard. It makes the cheese taste more intensely of cheese. The chemical compounds in mustard activate the flavor receptors responsible for perceiving savory depth, amplifying the existing flavor of the cheddar without adding any flavor of their own. Professional chefs call this a flavor enhancer. Your nan called it how you make a proper cheese sauce. Without it, a cheese sauce made with mild cheddar tastes bland and slightly floury. With a pinch of mustard powder, the same sauce tastes rich, sharp, and completely satisfying. The cheese goes further. You use less of it. The family thinks you have splashed out on a finer block when you have not spent a penny more. A tin of Coleman's mustard powder costs about £1.50 and lasts the better part of a year. The jar of ready-made cheese sauce it replaces costs £2 and tastes of nothing but salt and modified starch. Your nan understood the economics of flavor better than any food manufacturer ever has. Secret 11. Salt crust on pastry. Here is one that even dedicated home bakers have largely forgotten. Before blind baking weights, before ceramic beans, before the fancy chainmail discs you can buy from kitchen shops for £12, your grandmother kept a cloth bag of coarse rock salt in the kitchen drawer, specifically for one purpose: weighing down pastry. When she lined a flan tin and needed to blind bake the case, she tipped rock salt in generous handfuls onto the greaseproof paper inside the pastry shell. The salt was heavy. It conducted heat evenly. It pressed every corner of the pastry flat, and it left a faint salted warmth on the base that made even a sweet tart taste more complex. When she was done, she tipped the salt back into the cloth bag. It lasted for years, decades even. It was never wasted. Ceramic baking beans were introduced commercially in the 1990s. Before that, rice and dried pulses were sometimes used. But old-school British cooks, the women who had learned from their own mothers before the war, used salt because salt was heavy, reusable, and free once you had bought the bag. A bag of rock salt costs under £1. A set of ceramic baking beans from a kitchen shop costs between £6 and £12. They weigh about the same and do exactly the same job. The difference is purely one of marketing. Secret 10. The cold oven cake method. This is one I personally think is the most underrated secret on this entire list, because it sounds completely wrong. Every modern recipe, every baking show, every food blogger alive will tell you to preheat your oven before baking a cake. Your grandmother, in many cases, did not. For certain dense, fat-rich cakes, particularly fruitcakes and pound cakes, she would place the tin in a cold oven and then turn the heat on. As the oven slowly came up to temperature, the butter and fat in the batter melted gradually rather than immediately. The outside of the cake did not set before the inside had properly risen. The result was an even, moist crumb with no domed top, no sunken center, and no burnt edges. This technique appeared in British recipe pamphlets from the 1930s and 1940s. It was standard knowledge for any woman who had learned to bake before electric ovens with precise thermostats became common. When ovens were unpredictable, starting cold was a way of giving the cake time to adjust. It worked so well that experienced bakers kept doing it long after they had reliable ovens, simply because the results were better. I actually called my mum after learning this because I knew she had lived through exactly this kind of baking, and she went quiet for a second and then said, yes, that is how her mother taught her. She had forgotten. She has been preheating ever since the 1980s. She said she would never do it again. Secret 9. Vinegar in bread dough. A teaspoon of white vinegar added to a basic bread dough does 3 things. It makes the crumbs slightly softer. It extends the shelf life of the loaf by 2 to 3 days. And it does both of those things for approximately half a penny. The acidity of the vinegar slightly inhibits the growth of the mold spores that cause bread to go stale. It also strengthens the gluten network in the dough, giving the bread a more elastic crumb that holds moisture longer. Professional bakers use a chemical equivalent packaged under names like dough conditioner or bread improver and sold to commercial bakeries at significant cost. Your grandmother used a bottle of Sarsens. In 1960, a loaf of bread that lasted 4 days was a loaf of bread that fed the family for 4 days. A loaf that went stale on day 2 was a loaf that represented waste, and waste was not a concept your grandmother had much patience for. The vinegar trick was not a baking tip, it was an economic calculation. Keep the bread fresh, keep the family fed, spend nothing extra doing it. The modern equivalent is the store-bought loaf, loaded with preservatives, calcium propionate, and a list of additives that runs to 8 ingredients before you get to the actual flour. Your grandmother achieved the same result with a teaspoon of vinegar. I know which kitchen I trust more. Secret 8. Brown paper bag for mushrooms. This one is short, sweet, and will immediately make you feel slightly ridiculous about every container of mushrooms you have ever bought. Do not store mushrooms in the plastic punnet they come in. Do not wrap them in cling film. Put them in a brown paper bag, loosely folded at the top, and place them in the fridge. They will last twice as long. Stay firm rather than going slimy, and taste better when you cook them. Mushrooms are living organisms that continue to respire after picking. They release moisture as they breathe. In a sealed plastic container, that moisture has nowhere to go. It collects on the surface of the mushrooms, creating exactly the warm, damp environment that bacteria need to get to work. In a brown paper bag, the moisture is absorbed by the paper. The mushrooms stay dry. They stay fresh. Your grandmother bought mushrooms loose from the greengrocer and carried them home in a paper bag. She never owned a plastic punnet in her life. She simply kept the bag and put it in the coolest corner of the larder, or later, the bottom of the fridge. Supermarkets sell mushrooms in sealed plastic because sealed plastic travels better on lorries and photographs better under strip lighting. Your grandmother's method photographs terribly and travels just fine. Funny how that works. Secret 7. Butter paper to grease tins. When your grandmother finished a block of butter, the paper wrapper went not into the bin, but into a folded pile in the fridge. That wrapper still had a thin coating of butter on the inside, enough to grease a cake tin, a loaf tin, or a baking tray perfectly and evenly. With no waste whatsoever, she would take the paper out, rub it firmly across the inside of the tin, working it into the corners, and the tin was ready. No melting a knob of butter, no reaching for the spray oil, no cooking spray with propellant chemicals that leave a residue after 600 degrees of heat, just the leftover butter from a wrapper she was going to throw away anyway. This sounds like the smallest thing on the list. I almost left it out, but the more I thought about it, the more it struck me as the most precise possible symbol of how your grandmother approached her kitchen. Nothing was finished until it was completely finished. The wrapper was not empty when the butter was gone. It was empty when there was not a single smear of fat left to be useful. That principle, that nothing gets thrown away while it still has use, sat behind every habit on this list. It is not a cooking tip, it is a philosophy, and it produced better food, less waste, and more dignity than anything a supermarket has ever packaged and put on a shelf. Secret 6. Tea towel over boiling rice. When your grandmother cooked rice, she did not time it to the second and drain it through a colander. She used the absorption method, which meant exactly the right amount of water in the pot, a lid on, and patience. But the secret was the final step. With 2 minutes left, she removed the lid, laid a clean, folded tea towel over the top of the pot, and replaced the lid on top of the cloth. The tea towel absorbed the steam that would otherwise have condensed back down into the rice and made the bottom layer soggy. What remained in the pot was perfectly separated. Fluffy rice with no clumping, no mushiness, and no water pooling at the bottom. This is a technique used across the Middle East, Persia, and Central Asia, where rice cookery is taken with the utmost seriousness. It arrived in British kitchens through Indian and Caribbean communities in the 1950s and 60s, and the smart home cooks of that era, always alert to a method that worked better than their own, adopted it immediately. A microwave rice pouch costs 89 pence and takes 2 minutes. A pot of rice made the old way costs about 8 pence and takes 20 minutes, most of which requires no attention whatsoever. The tea towel costs nothing. The difference in taste is not subtle. It is enormous. Secret 5. Eggshells to clarify stock. This is the one I honestly could not believe when I first came across it. I had to go verify it myself because it seemed too strange to be true, and it is completely, absolutely, 100% true. When your grandmother made stock and found it cloudy, she did not throw it away and start again. She took the crushed shells from 2 or 3 eggs, dropped them into the simmering liquid, and waited. Within 15 minutes, the cloudiness had gathered around the shells, which she then strained out through muslin. The result was a clear, golden stock that looked like it had taken hours of careful skimming to achieve. The science is elegant. Eggshells are porous and carry a residual protein from the membrane that clings to their inner surface. That protein attracts and binds to the suspended particles that cause cloudiness in stock. As the shells move through the liquid, they collect impurities like tiny magnets, drawing them together into clumps that can be easily removed. Professional kitchens use a preparation called a clarification raft, made from egg whites and minced meat, to achieve the same effect when making consommé. The technique costs a small fortune in ingredients and takes 30 minutes of careful temperature management. Your grandmother used the shells from the eggs she had already cracked for breakfast. 0 additional cost. 15 minutes. Perfectly clear stock. Secret 4. Soaking dried fruit in cold tea. Every Christmas cake recipe your grandmother ever made started the night before, with dried fruit soaking in cold tea. Not brandy, not rum, not orange juice. Cold, strong leftover tea from the pot that had been sitting since afternoon. The tea served 3 functions. The liquid plumped the fruit, rehydrating the dried currants, sultanas, and raisins, so they did not draw moisture out of the cake batter during baking and leave the crumb dry. The tannins in the tea added a subtle complexity to the fruit's flavor that water alone could not provide, and the slight bitterness of the cold tea balanced the intense sweetness of the fruit and sugar, giving the finished cake that rounded, deep flavor that cheap Christmas cakes have never been able to replicate. In 1955, a quarter pound of mixed dried fruit cost about 4 pence. A pot of tea had already been made and drunk. Using the cold remains to soak the fruit cost literally nothing. Today, recipe books and cooking shows recommend soaking dried fruit in alcohol, which does produce a wonderful result, but also requires spending money on a bottle of brandy, most of which disappears over the course of the Christmas baking season. Your grandmother got 90% of the same result from the cold dregs in the teapot. I love this one because it reminds me of something that happened in my own kitchen. The first Christmas I tried baking a fruitcake, I used cold tea because I had seen my nan do it and the brandy felt extravagant. A friend who tasted it asked me what my secret was. I did not have an answer because it did not feel like a secret. It felt like common sense. That is exactly what your grandmother would have said. Secret 3, the margarine tub freezer system. Before Tupperware, before color-coded freezer bags, before the stackable airtight containers filling every modern kitchen drawer, your grandmother ran her entire freezer storage system using one thing exclusively: empty margarine tubs, Stork, Blue Band, Summer County. Every tub was washed, dried, and stacked beside the freezer. Into them went leftover soup, portioned stock, the spare half tin of tomatoes, the 2 tablespoons of rice, too small to serve, but too good to bin. Each tub had a lid, each tub stacked neatly, and each one had already been paid for as part of the margarine purchase, which meant the entire system cost nothing. She was running a first in first out inventory system with 6 mini tubs and common sense. The average British household today spends up to £30 a year on food storage products. Your grandmother spent nothing, and here is the part nobody mentions. Margarine tubs are made from exactly the same plastic as expensive storage containers. The lid seals exactly the same way. The only difference is the branding and the £15 you pay for believing it. Secret 2, bread crust in the biscuit tin. Your grandmother never stored biscuits without tucking a hard, dry bread crust into the tin alongside the digestives. One crust from the end of the loaf, swapped out every few days. The crust absorbed the moisture inside the tin, before it could reach the biscuits. Biscuits go soft because they absorb atmospheric moisture. The bread crust acts as a sacrificial absorber, staying soft itself, while everything around it stays crisp. It is the same principle as those silica gel packets that come inside shoeboxes, saying do not eat. Your grandmother achieved identical moisture control with a piece of leftover crust that cost nothing and got fed to the birds when she was done with it. No spending, no product, no specialist knowledge. No, just awareness. Knowing the problem existed and knowing the solution was already sitting in the bread bin. Your grandmother solved it for free in 1952. The dehumidifying product industry solved it for £4.99 in 2023. Make of that what you will. Secret 1. Dripping on toast. Number 1 is the one I keep coming back to. And honestly, once you understand it, it changes everything that came before it. Dripping. Beef dripping, saved from the Sunday roast, cooled in a ceramic pot beside the hob, spread cold and thick onto toast with a pinch of salt. Breakfast in millions of British homes from the 1800s right through to the 1970s, free, a byproduct of the joint she had already paid for, already roasted, already carved. The food industry did not ban it. They did something more effective. They told a generation that animal fat was dangerous, that saturated fat would kill you, that the ceramic pot by the hob belonged to an unhealthy past, and slowly, reluctantly, the pot was put away. Not because people believed it was wrong, because the pressure to believe it was relentless. In its place came margarine, cooking spray, and vegetable oils that tasted of absolutely nothing. Progress, they called it. Recent nutritional research has quietly begun rehabilitating animal fats. The studies that condemned them have been found significantly flawed. Your grandmother did not need the research. She just needed toast on a cold Monday morning, and she already had everything required to make it extraordinary. What connects every secret on this list is not thrift, though they are all extraordinarily thrifty. It is confidence. Your grandmother knew what she was doing, and she knew why it worked. She did not need a product to validate her method. That confidence was built through years of watching, doing, and passing on, refined through necessity until only what genuinely worked remained. The supermarkets did not take that from her. What they did was ensure it stopped being passed on.